Hi guys, so today I'm here to do a bit of like a combo video. I wanted to film something that kind of reflected back on 2019 as the year is coming to an end, and I also wanted to do a bit of a Q&A. So on Instagram I asked for your questions, some of which aren't specifically about 2019, but I did mention that this would be part of a reflective video, so a lot of them are quite specific. So I thought that these questions would essentially give me a framework to chat about 2019 within, if that makes sense. I can already see that a lot of similar topics have come up repeatedly. I did look at this at the time, but it's been over a week, so this is a whole refresh of my memory as well. And without further ado, I think that's pretty self-explanatory, so let's just have a look at what you guys have asked and take a look back on the year. What is so funny is the sort of questions that have come up more than once, just in different words. So right next to one another, two people have asked, what's a really valuable lesson 2019 has taught you, and what piece of advice were you given this year that you'll always refer back to? Because I think those kind of play on the same thing. And to be honest, one of the biggest changes in my life in 2019, one of the biggest steps I think I have taken in 2019 isn't to do with like career, it isn't to do with university, it isn't to do with a lot of the things that I think people see as being like tangible evidence for progression or like advancement in your life. It's to have started going to counselling regularly. Most of you know, I'm sure, although new people turn up all the time, so some of you might not, that back in 2017, so 2 years ago now, my dad was diagnosed with terminal cancer. He kind of lived for around 6 months from the diagnosis to passing away. It's the 6 months of which I spent helping care for him with my mum, and then obviously I lost my dad, who was 59, which is incredibly unfair. That's like just how else can you describe it? And it's obviously had its impact on my life since then. The grieving process, for those of you that haven't necessarily experienced that kind of loss in your life, is not something that you can go through in a period of months. And what I've noticed talking to other people who've been through like comparable experiences is that sometimes the immediate aftermath of losing somebody is when you really just kind of like buckle down, you put your head down, you try and just get on with life and work and everything else, and you just want to like not move on but just carry on before you can even really start to process the emotions. But they do catch up with you, and they are always there lingering in the back of your mind even if you're not dealing with them. And I've just found that gradually over the past 2 years I've slowed down, and although I wasn't necessarily conscious of it, a lot of those emotions were building up in my mind because I wasn't necessarily giving myself time to deal with them. And I started going to counselling this year, both to talk about the loss of my dad, but as well as other things that are happening now and have happened in the past. This is the wonderful thing about counselling, is I can just get all on my chest and we can just talk about it all, because I this year have learned so much about myself and my reactions to things, and like things like anxiety and just kind of how I deal with things and cope with things based on kind of experiences I had as a child, which I think sounds a little bit cheesy, but it's very true, and it's been such a positive experience. So I think the biggest takeaway from 2019 for me is that counselling is excellent. If you feel like you could benefit from counselling or therapy, whatever you call it, then please do look into it. I know it's incredibly hard to get on the NHS. I did have some brief grief counselling after the passing of my dad, but this year I decided to go private, and it's not cheap and it is a big chunk of my budget every month, but it's what I've chosen to prioritise what little extra money I have, which I know doesn't even apply to everybody. You might not have that little bit of extra, and that's like a whole other discussion, the kind of mental health care system and the mess that it's in. But that's the route I have gone down, and it has been the best thing I've done with this year. And I think what I'm learning from that, advice wise, to circle back to the question, is to kind of develop an additional voice in my head, which sounds a little bit wacky, but I get really anxious, I panic a lot, due to lots of things that in the past, you know, that kind of make me go there. You know, I've been through some really freaking awful things in recent years, as well as stuff I had to deal with when I was younger, and therefore my reaction is to kind of think the worst. And I am kind of trying to learn to like go easy on myself, to be flexible, to not worry so much about the future, to like look forward to things but like live in the present, and also to just be able to like sort of, as soon as I start to panic, as soon as I start to get anxious, it's sort of like that other voice, that kind of sensible voice in my head, that kind of like third parent, whatever, say to myself, Jean, like pause, stop in your tracks, get back to the original issue, don't start kind of thinking the worst and then also putting things off because you assume they're going to go terribly. It's kind of hard to talk about that kind of stuff, I think, because yes, there's lots of like nice bits of general advice you can give somebody, and there's lots of cute phrases you can share on Instagram, but we're individuals and our experiences are individual, and we have lots of people go through similar things, but it's good to understand yourself and kind of exactly the kind of mental process that you go through on an everyday basis. And therefore I think I've just been learning more about myself, and therefore knowing about myself and why I do things is helping me kind of change myself and improve myself, if that makes sense. I think so I think what I've learned in 2019 is reflection is like important in terms of growth, if that makes sense, or just like self-care. I also had somebody ask what things have helped you cope with grief over the last year, and I know some other people ask me stuff like that as well. Again, I like have really benefited from counselling this year. I think in lots of ways I was putting off my grief, as upset as I was, and actually talking about my dad and losing him in counselling has brought it to the forefront of my mind. So I've actually spent a lot of time quite upset about it, but because I need to be, and I think that's the thing that's helped me cope with grief the most, is kind of embracing grief in a positive way, in that like I need to grieve and that's okay. I need to not beat myself up for grieving, but I also need to remember that I'm still alive. My dad would want me to live my life if he was still here. So it's finding that kind of balance. It's like you don't either just completely give up or completely repress. It's kind of doing both, if that makes sense. And again, counselling has just been like the biggest help to me in terms of coping with that grief. Okay, I also had quite a few people ask me about how my PhD is going. If you don't know, I'm doing a PhD. I've been doing a PhD for literally 4 years now. January 2020 will mark the 4th year, like the end of the 4th year of my PhD, but I'm part-time, and I've also been dealing with some other stuff in that time, which brings me on to the topic of why I haven't been filming PhD update videos. It's not because I've dropped out, it's not because I've stopped doing it, because somebody did ask me if I'm still doing my PhD. It's because honestly I don't know how to talk about my PhD, and I have struggled since my dad passed away. Again, I think it took me a while to realise, but I've slowed down the pace at which I was doing my research, and that's because my PhD and academia and studying was something that very much connected me to my dad. It was something we shared. Now, my dad grew up in a small mining town in Scotland. He left school at 16, went and trained and worked down the mines until, you know, Maggie Thatcher came along. And he didn't go to university himself until he was a mature student. So I was a child when he was at university. He did start a master's but had to drop out during his master's because of a combination of mental health and financial situation. Education is expensive, but even though he didn't continue on with university, he was the most encouraging person with me when it came to my education, as was my mum. I come from, you know, like a working class household where I didn't have parents that could give me tons of money, but I was lucky enough to have parents that gave me so much support and encouragement, and I don't think I'd be here today without either of them, and that's amazing. But because of losing like 50% of that kind of support and encouragement, the person that proofread all of my essays, I have struggled with my studies. Like, I find it much more difficult to sit down, or I did find it much more difficult to sit down, you know, for like a whole day, like 8 hours, and just research, which is something I used to love, and still love. I don't want to say I don't love that anymore, but it took me a while to realise that I was like sort of reacting quite emotionally and getting quite upset when I was studying, and thinking about the future, which is something that I connect with my PhD. So I would say I plan now on finishing later than I initially intended to, but again, I need to remind myself, I spent 6 months of my PhD caring for my dad. Like, this is why I feel like I can't do a PhD update video, because people look for advice, and I'm very much one of those people that sits down and talks about PhD and can be like, well, this is the good stuff that's happened, this is what I've ticked off, and like look at it from that perspective and try and put a positive spin on it. But honestly, like, I've slowed down, and PhDs are difficult enough anyway, regardless. Everyone finds PhDs difficult. I've never met anybody that was like, that was a breeze. So it's a lot of work, and I initially wanted to finish it in 5 years because I'm part-time. I now plan on aiming for 6, so I got 2 years left, which is still a chunk of time, and I'm getting back into it. Now that I've acknowledged the kind of emotional connection I was having with my studying, I am now more aware and more able to kind of work through that and remind myself again that my dad would want me to be doing this. He would be so encouraging. You know, he can't proofread my essays anymore, but in a sense he still like exists in a form through like my studies, because he did history as well. He loved history, and like he would want me to do it for myself, and I also want to do it for him, and it's like a wonderful positive thing that I shared with him, so I shouldn't be upset whilst striving for it just because he's not going to get to see me graduate, if that makes sense. So it's sort of like I was like experiencing a kind of unconscious emotional connection that was then impacting me negatively in my studies, and I'm now learning how to turn that on its head and kind of re-embrace my love of studying, if that makes sense. But it has meant that, yeah, I've slowed down. I now think my, you know, submission deadline is further in the future than it initially was. Thank God that you can take extra time with a part-time PhD, and that I can work alongside it because it is part-time. So that's kind of where I am at with my PhD. It's been an emotional journey. I still love what I'm studying, and I still, more than anything else, care about what I'm studying. I study sexual violence in democratic Athens, in ancient Athens, and I think it's an important topic that needs more scholarship on it, and as most PhDs, you know, I'm looking at something that hasn't had a great deal of attention and requires some, you know, time and energy put into it so that we can acknowledge it. So I still think it's very important, and I'm still, you know, very passionate about it and pursuing it into the new year, and I'm hoping that I'm just going to be able to like really kind of re-immerse myself in a way that I've struggled with of late. Somebody else asked me, what's the thing you're most proud of this year? I mean, I'm still proud of myself for going to counselling, but other things that I'm proud of, I haven't really talked about this on my channel. I will talk about it more when kind of the release comes up, but something I have done in 2019, I couldn't remember what year it is I wrote a children's book. I have written a introduction to Greek myth for children, which is coming out in 2020 with DK Publishing, who are one of my favourite children's publishers. They're sort of like informational, educational publisher that like specialise, you know, in kind of like non-fiction and informative books, and I adored them as a kid. I had a lot of their books, or would borrow them from the library because I just loved learning, and I have worked with them to create this book this year. It's not the kind of publishing deal that I think a lot of people are usually familiar with. It wasn't a book that I proposed, it was a book concept that DK were looking for somebody to write, and I wrote some chapters for as writing samples, and they decided that I would be the right person. So that was absolutely wonderful, and I've so enjoyed doing that. It is an illustrated book, and it's absolutely beautiful. I cannot wait to show it to you. I didn't illustrate it, obviously, but I will get around to talking about that more nearer the release date. I also got a literary agent this year. I have always wanted to be an author, and I think the children's book is kind of like a tick on that box, but equally I want to write for adults, and I've been working on a non-fiction book about classics. I won't say any more than that, but about a specific classics topic, an accessible like commercial non-fiction book, not like an academic text, and I found an agent for it. So I'm hoping that come 2020 we'll be finding a publisher for it, and I'll be finishing it and maybe, you know, talking more about it in the future. That would be wonderful. I still haven't finished my fiction novel, which is something I'd like to do in 2020, but you know, I've written bits of it. Like, I've still been progressing, and I've passed 50,000 words of my fantasy fiction book that I'm trying to write. So that's also like pat on the back for me. So yeah, I feel like really good about the fact that, you know, my dreams of becoming an author and a published, you know, writer are well on their way and are kind of starting to come about. I know that careers and life and everything is not linear, so I know it's not like, you know, you write one children's picture book and you're sorted and you don't even need to worry about like seeking out work in the future because everyone just brings it to you. That's not how it works, but it makes me, I don't know, but it just gives me a little confidence boost, right? Like, it makes me feel like, yes, this is on the cards for me, what I always wanted to do. So that has been wonderful. A lot of questions about like how have you grown personally in 2019. I feel like I've covered that. Somebody else asked if you could travel anywhere in 2020, where would you go? If I could travel anywhere, top of my list would be New York. I mean, I've always wanted to go to the USA. I've never been before. I'd just like to experience that culturally. And New York is top of my list, but it's very expensive, so I'm not gonna hold out. If there's a way to do it that's like more financially viable, then great, but that would be like top of my list if we're just going for like where would you like to go, wherever. Best new for you author you started reading this year. I also got a question that I flipped by earlier that was asking me about, oh yeah, what's the type of book you've read in 2019 that you'd like to read more of in 2020, and that's what I'm going to mention now. For both of those questions, can you guess? It's historical romance, and it's Tessa Dare. I just filmed a video all about the best new authors I discovered in 2019 for me personally, like new favourites, and one of the 4 was Tessa Dare, and she writes historical romance, which is a genre I did not read before this year. I found out about her through Amanda over at the Naughty Librarian, and I've read about 10 books by her in 2019, and I would both like to keep reading her books because she still has more in 2020, but also read more historical romance books and authors. I've already got a few on my list that I'd like to read. I hear Cat Sebastian's pretty good, people really like her. I've also got some audiobooks saved on Scribd, which are historical romance novels about 2 women who fall in love. I'm like, yes, that sounds amazing. My friend Taylor, I've forgotten the author's name, but my friend Taylor recommended a historical romance writer to me the other day, and I picked up one of her books, which you'll probably see in a book haul soon. So I just want to read more of that because it's like the most fun, light-hearted escapism, but also like I feel like Tessa Dare is also like pretty feminist in her writing, which I enjoy. Somebody else asked, what are your hopes and dreams for your career path right now? I mean, I want to be a writer. That's all I've ever wanted to be. I mean, yes, academia and scholarship and all that stuff, but I still think it feeds into the same part of me. And I want to write both like academic scholarship, research, but I also want to write like accessible non-fiction and fiction. So I kind of want to write everything. I mean, I don't want to write everything, but I want to write. Like, that has always been my dream since I was like 7 years old. And the more I spend in different worlds and the more time I spend writing and sort of just getting older and experiencing the world, the more I know that is what I want to do in different formats. So if I could do anything to progress that in 2020, it would be to get a publishing deal for my adult non-fiction book and to finish a first draft of my fiction novel. I don't expect it to be in a kind of shape in which I would get it published in 2020 because I haven't even finished it yet, and then I plan on going back and kind of like rejigging massive chunks of it. So I still want to, you know, do that in my spare time in between actual paid work. So I want to do that. And I want to work on making classics and ancient history accessible because it's a topic that I'm passionate about and I care about, and I want to write scholarship and do research like my PhD is part of. I enjoy teaching on occasion. Sometimes I teach at the university. I like imparting that knowledge and sharing that knowledge. That's what I love. So whilst I want to write like academic articles, and I'm hoping to write an article for a academic book that's coming out in 2 years, I think, in 2021. I don't want to exclusively write stuff that's going to be read by other scholars. I want to be able to write things that people who don't know anything about antiquity can read, which is why I want to write my non-fiction book that I've been writing. And that's why I do my podcast, because even though nobody pays me to do my podcast, like, it's a way of sharing that information. I don't know if that's just because that's the kind of person I am, because my parents raised me to be that way. I don't know if it's because before university I had very limited access to that kind of knowledge because it wasn't taught to me in school. It was something I just came across myself by, you know, watching a documentary on Channel 5 or getting a DK book out the library. So I want to be part of that, and I kind of want to break down some of maybe like the traditional views around that subject and also talk about why it's so relevant to modern readers. So I want to keep up my podcast, I want to do some more writing. I'd like to do more talks as well. So I've done a few talks to children outside of teaching at a university level, which are around an hour of me just chatting about how amazing ancient Greek myths are and hopefully inspiring some of the new generation of classicists. So I would like to do more of that. Basically, like, classics outreach and writing is kind of what I want to do with my life. But I'm open to seeing what form all of that takes as the years go on. Books about feminism you read in 2019 that everyone should read. I'll mention one book here because it's short and I think it very much encompasses what feminism needs to be in 2020. Not that it's a new invention, but we need to kind of carry through this kind of way of feminism into the new year. And that is Feminism for the 99%. I will link it down below and I will talk about it in more detail in my best books of 2020 video, spoilers. Also, I just had a thought returning to the question about places you'd like to travel in 2020. Somewhere I might actually go is Blackpool. My mum loves Blackpool. She used to go every summer as a kid, and then we used to go when I was a kid as well with my grandparents, and she's wanting to go because we haven't been in years and years and years, so I might go to Blackpool. Somebody else did actually specifically ask me, how is the novel going? Any writing tips? I don't have any writing tips. What I found writing this fiction novel is that you should just write. Like, I genuinely think some of the paragraphs I've written in this 51,000 words are absolute tripe, but I think some others are genius, just to compliment myself. So I think it's just to write it all down and come back and deal with the mess later. That's kind of my attitude towards fiction at the moment, but like I mentioned, I'm just over 50,000 words now. I think I just reached a point as well in 2020 where it got much harder. Sorry, I meant 2019, but I started this novel in 2018 and I was flying through it initially, and then I got to that bit where you're like, oh my goodness, I need to kind of find a way to wrap this up and kind of set the seeds for wrapping this book up and write the climax and all of that stuff. And it just got much harder to do that, rather than writing all like the fun setup and the background and the introductory stuff. So it's slower going now, but I'm still working on it, and luckily for me, my wonderful friend Jill reads every chapter as I write it, because I've been writing it chronologically. If you've never heard me talk about this novel before, then the kind of way I've been summing it up to friends is that it's like a socialist fantasy novel with dragons and loads of queer characters. I know I do have lots of other questions from people, but I think I've actually answered a lot of the things that they're asking, or they're kind of repeating questions I've already answered specifically. So I'll finish on this, which is, could you choose your fave book of the decade? Now that is difficult because it's been a big decade. This past decade has been me leaving high school, going to university, going, like, you know, like it's a big decade. I've read a lot. I started BookTube, I've read hundreds of books. I don't know if I could pick my best book of the decade. Okay, this is a very spur of the moment answer, so, you know, if I change my mind in a month, don't have a go at me. But right now, a book off the top of my head that came out in the past decade and I read in the past decade that had a massive impact on me is Everyday Sexism by Laura Bates. That is one of the best books about sexism and misogyny in society I've ever read. It had me in tears. I got so many different people to read it, and it's one of the reasons I actually even started a feminist book club, which I now run with my friend Lauren over at Lauren Wade Reads. So that book, you know, means a lot to me and meant a lot to me in the past decade. So I think that's one of the best. I'm not gonna say it's the best, but I would really recommend that as a book I've read in the past decade and came out in the past decade. So I think I've kind of covered most of the questions, and I think I've done a pretty like exhaustive job of covering a lot of what's happened in the past year, to be honest. Real mishmash of a video, I recognise that, but I also feel like in the past year I've really felt like a lot of these things are things we need to talk about more. We need to talk about grief in a public forum. I'm not saying that you need to share personal stuff that you're not comfortable with, but I think like as a world, as a society, as a people, we need to talk about grief, because it's very hard to deal with grief when you feel like it's something that you should be silent about. I also think we need to talk about counselling and mental health and encourage one another to seek out help, and not to be embarrassed about seeking out help, or never to feel like your problems aren't big enough to seek out help, because that's not the point. But also to celebrate the small victories even when the bigger things feel like they're not quite going to plan. It's just to sort of remind yourself, you know, you survived another day, you kept going, you did something, and that's awesome. So I think that's 2019 in a nutshell. Please do feel free to leave any questions or comments down below. I'd love to chat to you guys. Let me know how your year's been going, even if some crappy stuff has happened and you need to get off your chest. Feel free to use this video in this comment section as a vehicle to do that. We can all kind of support one another a little bit, hopefully. And I will see you all again in the next one. Bye guys!